Everyone. I want to welcome you to our session. We are here with the amazing David Kelly. And first, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Megan Mucci, and I am a curriculum developer for Viva Systems. I'll be the facilitator today. So if you have any questions, comments along the way, or anything you'd like to draw our attention to, please do so in the chat. We'll be utilizing that a bunch, I would assume. Just wanted to take a quick second to thank all of the sponsors that are here on our lovely slide. Without them, our presentation would not be possible. So we definitely want to give them a shout out and thank you for your sponsorship. Just to go back to David a little bit and tell you a little bit about him. He is the Executive Vice President and Executive Director of the Learning Guild, one of my favorite organizations so far. And David comes to us with over 30 years of learning and development experience. He just told me his story about his transition from banker into learning and development pro, and it's inspiring for sure. So we're especially lucky to have him here with us, but more importantly, what he's talking to us about, which is emerging trends in digital learning. It seems like the world kind of switched to this idea of digital learning seemingly overnight, but in reality, it's been kind of a thing for a long time. So I'm really interested in learning about all the things David's going to tell us. So let's get started.
Thanks so much. And welcome, everyone. As Megan was saying, I'm going to share my screen here. There we go. That's the start of the presentation. As Megan was saying, we're here today to talk about the world of digital learning. Just a couple of logistics before I jump into the presentation. You can feel free to engage in chat with each other, with yourselves. We're also a small group here, and I believe the room is set up that you can unmute your mics. I encourage interaction and make this more of a discussion than just a straight up lecture. So by all means, feel free to become part of the conversation, whether that be through chat, whether that be by unmuting and putting your video on. Be part of the discussion here today. I'm from New York. I'm used to being either the person being interrupted or doing the interrupting myself. So it's no problem, and I encourage that, and it always makes for a more interesting session if people are engaging in there. So ask questions throughout, participate as much as you can. Before we get into the session, I want to point out one URL on the screen. There we go, right now. That URL that you see there, I'll show it again at the end, will take you to a page on my blog, which has the slides associated with this session. It'll have the resources that I mentioned during the session, as well as a host of additional resources that I've curated that enable you to take a deeper dive into some of the topics that we're going to be talking about here today. So again, I'll show that URL at the end, but a lot of people ask the question about slides, and you'll see as we go through here, my slides are more supportive of the content than not the content itself. But my slides and all the content that I mentioned and all the resources that you might want to dig deeper into are available via the URL that you see on screen.
And I can post it in the chat as we get to the end of the presentation.
Yeah, I see Juliet already did it, so thank you for that. So we're here today to talk about this idea of digital learning. This is the term that we're talking about here today. And I think taking a few minutes before we jump into some of the actual trends, is putting some context around this. I think that spending a little bit of time putting some context around what this conversation is and how I view it when I have a conversation like this. And the first thing starts with the language that we're using. Again, the phrase we're using here is digital learning. And it's a phrase that's been around for a long time, but it's caught a lot more energy in recent years, and especially in recent months based on everything that we're going through with the pandemic. It's also a phrase, the energy that we have around the pandemic has made digital learning a buzzword again. And personally, I hate buzzwords. And the reason I hate buzzwords is because of the way that I define them. I define a buzzword as a term whose usage is spreading faster than its understanding. And I would qualify digital learning as a buzzword. And I think that we are at risk with digital learning of taking a phrase and diluting it of its value. And I think it's important to recognize what I mean by that. Digital learning is not about using digital means to do what we do. It's not about using digital technology to support education and training. That's how the definition is starting to emerge through the way that through its usage. But I think that if that's the definition that through our usage becomes the norm, I think we're losing out on a tremendous opportunity. And it's not to say that digital education and training is bad in any way, shape, or form, but it's important to recognize that it's different, that there's a different definition that has a lot of possibilities for us around this phrase digital learning that is different than simply defining it as digital education and training. And it has a lot to do with just the way that we live our lives today, the way that the world is changing around us, and what it means to exist in a digital world. And I want to share two simple examples of what I mean when I say that we need to focus more on what this phrase means to us. First one has to do with this guy. This is my son, Shay. This is Christmas morning, I think 2 years ago, and he's playing with the favorite toy that he got that year. It's a little, if you're familiar with Star Wars, you might recognize that character there. It's a little toy droid, BB-8, that was remote controlled, and you would install an app on your phone to control this thing and drive it around like a remote control car. Favorite toy, and if we're being completely honest, he got it for Christmas because I wanted to play with it. But that morning, he loved this toy. And as mentioned, in order to use it, you would have to install an app on your phone to control it, work through Bluetooth. And my son's playing with it, and after he opened up all the toys, he's playing with it. I'm in the other room making breakfast, and he comes in and he says, "Dad, I need your phone." I had installed the app on my wife's phone, so I'm immediately starting to get nervous, thinking, "Oh no, he broke my wife's phone. This is not going to be a good start to Christmas." And I said, "Well, yeah, what happened to Mom's phone?" He said, "No, I want to watch a YouTube video on how to use this." Now, you have to realize something about the Kelly household. There are two different sides to the Kelly household. There is me, who is everything digital is the new shiny. I want to play with it. I want to experiment with it. I want to see what it is. And my wife is the other side of the spectrum, where she's like, put down the phone, go outside, kick a ball for a little bit. And we balance each other out very well with that. So my wife doesn't like him to be on the phone in the first place. And the idea of her walking downstairs and seeing him with not one, but two phones in his hands is not really a good idea. So I had said to him this morning, saying, I get what you want to do, but you're going to have to close out the app to use the toy, go to YouTube, watch the video, and close YouTube and come back and watch the app. And I can't tell you how unreasonable I was as a father for making this suggestion. But he had to deal with it. So sorry, you can't have two phones. You're going to have to figure it out. I go back to making breakfast. I come back in, and before I come back in, I'm called basically into the room because I hear the YouTube playing, but it's playing really loud, like way too loud for a phone. And I walk in, and there's my son with the phone, playing with the toy, and then on the TV screen is the YouTube video that he wanted to watch, playing on the TV. He figured out how to use YouTube on the Roku, and he solved this problem. And what I found most interesting in that moment, as I'm watching him and wondering whether or not I should compliment him for his ingenuity or reprimand him for not following my instructions, I looked down at the box, and there in the box, still perfectly sealed in plastic, was the 48-page, some-odd page instruction manual, still sealed perfectly in the plastic, that he had absolutely no interest in using. And it's not about his age. It's not about being a digital native. It's not about a younger generation or any other stereotype we want to throw at it. It's about what it means to exist in a digital world where we have these devices that solve problems for us, even if that problem is something as simple as I don't know. It's changing our human behavior, what it means to exist in a digital environment. Now, that's a very personal story from my standpoint, but I want to give another example that's more universal. You've probably all been in this situation. You're out to dinner with your friends. It's the greatest dinner party of all time. The food is great. The drinks are flowing. The conversation is just natural, and it's rolling, and everybody's laughing, and it's the most comfortable dinner party of all time. You look as fabulous as the people up on the screen. And then somebody asks a question at that table that brings no one knows the answer to. And it brings the table to a silence because nobody knows the answer to the question. We've all been in that sort of an environment where someone asks a question and everyone's quiet because nobody really knows the answer. And we've all been in that environment. And we all have had the same person, the same way to break that silence. Someone will break the silence by saying something. Whether you open up your mic or use chat, give me an idea of what you think someone's going to say to break that silence. Also gives me a chance to take a drink. I see Megan. I'll look it up. Yeah. I mean, what a lot. And Rosemary, you said it on the nail on the head. I'll Google it. That's what people do in this moment. We have these devices in the pocket. I'll Google it. I'll give you another example of it that I know, even though I haven't met most of you on here. I've made this bet when I've given this presentation, dozens of times, and no one's ever been able to make a bet. I'll make a bet in my house that something was never said in that environment, which is no one had that environment say, you know what, that's a great question. I'm going to log into the LMS and get the answer. And that's not a criticism of the LMS systems by any stretch of the imagination. LMSs and learning platforms in general provide an amazing resource and an important tool in the work that we do. Those are educational and training tools, and that's the context of educational training. But another thing nobody at that table said was, you know what, I'm going to pull my phone out and get the answer because I'm a self-directed learner. Self-directed learning is our jargon. And self-directed learning, it might look like that, someone figuring it out, but what self-directed learning looks like in daily life isn't learning. People wouldn't describe it as learning, they'd describe it as solving a problem. How many times have you had something that you wanted to do in modern times that you want to figure out how to do something and you go to YouTube to see if there's a tutorial? You're not doing it because you're like, myself, I do that all the time. I have something's wrong with my toilet in my house. Before I call a plumber, I'm going to go on YouTube. And it's not because I want to learn how to be a plumber. It's because I want to fix whatever's wrong with my toilet. And that's what self-directed learning looks like in practice. And I bring that into the context of digital learning, because if you want to understand what digital learning is, it's not about the behaviors of education and training. If you want to really harness the potential of what digital learning is and how it can transform our practice, you don't look at the educational training behaviors. It's not about the word digital, and that's what's different. What's really different is about the learning, because we're focusing on learning behaviors. How are people naturally behaving in a digital environment that we are walking around with the ability to solve our problems of not knowing how to do things in the moment when we need to, with whatever platform we want to use? It fundamentally changes what learning looks like, and thus how we support learning in the work that we do. If you want to understand how technology is going to change the work that we do and how people learn in general, you don't look at the world of education and training. If you want to understand how technology is going to change how we learn, you have to look at how technology is changing how we live our daily lives. And that is what is ultimately going to shape how the expectations that we have for education and training. I work for the Learning Guild. We are a professional development organization like ATD. We have magazine, we have research reports. We do conferences every single year, a number of different conferences with our expos. You've probably been to one of the events in our industry that have an expo. And you walk around that expo and you're seeing learning and development technologies, what we call learning technologies. But I would argue they're not really learning technologies. They're a subset of learning technologies. They're education and training technologies. Doesn't make them better, doesn't make them worse, but it's an acknowledgement of what they are. From my perspective, and this again comes from the environment of someone who runs some of the largest learning and technology expos in our industry. The most important event that I follow every single year in terms of understanding how technology is changing how we learn isn't a Learning Guild show. It's not an ATD show. It's not any of our learning and development resources. The most important resource for me in this context is the Consumer Electronics Show that happens in Las Vegas every year. Because that is the show where the technologies that are emerging that are going to enter our homes and our workplaces and change the way that we do things, change the way that we live, we work, we play in an increasingly digital world. It's shaping how we just exist, and those behaviors are going to naturally affect how we learn through those interactions. And it sets expectations for what it means to exist in a digital world and what it means to learn in a digital world that inform our practice in the way that we support it in the organizations that we work for. So I think it's a really important thing for us to recognize. And ultimately it comes down, I want to give one more example as we move forward that puts, before we get into the actual trends, that really puts it into context here. Because we're talking about a simple thing here, or as we talk about these trends and how it's going to affect our field. We're talking about a word called disruption. I mentioned earlier I'm interested in language. My fascination with language is multifaceted. And I love the word disruption because disruption is a word that people respond to viscerally. they either respond positive or negatively, meaning like it's a disruption, it's gonna make things different, it's change, I don't like change, and they respond negatively towards it. Or it's like a corporate buzzword where we're gonna be disruptive. What are we gonna disrupt? I don't know, but we need to disrupt something because it's edgy and it's different, so we're gonna be disruptive. And it's a positive reaction to the word. But the reality is the word disruption is completely neutral. It just simply means a change to the status quo. It is not a positive change. It is not a negative change. It just means it's a change to the status quo. And it's not the change that is positive or negative. It's how we look at it. It's how we react to the change that makes a disruption positive or negative. And as we look at the trends in the future and how it's going to impact our work, we have to decide how are we going to respond to our work being disrupted by these trends. And we also should inform ourselves as we look forward to the fact that we've been through this before. Technology has disrupted our industry many times. Many of you have probably lived through some of these disruptions. One of the biggest ones, many of you have probably come from a world where you either used to do classroom training and now it's all technology based, or maybe you still do some level of classroom training. But as Megan mentioned in the intro, I've been in this industry for decades, which makes me sound very old. That's why I keep the hair short, tied to the gray. But I've been in this industry for decades. I come from a world and an environment where this is what training was. It's all we had. Before e-learning emerged, we had a classroom. I was a facilitator. I used InDesign and Word to create my facilitator guides and my participant workbooks. And I was the facilitator in the front of the room, dealing with the attendees in the room, and we created all these different experiences. And this is what training was. This is what the expectation of learning was. And when people came into the workshop, they were conditioned through 12 plus years of school that this is what learning looks like. And then suddenly personal computers emerged. And we had this disruption that suddenly came out where we had e-learning, where we could learn how to do something we could learn or be educated or be trained through a computer. And it really disrupted things. Now, my question for you related to that is, who was e-learning disruptive to? We can acknowledge that it's disruptive, but who were the people, who were the entities that were disrupted by e-learning? Whether you want to open up your mic or use chat, feel free. Give me a couple of examples of who you think e-learning was disruptive to. Again, I want your answers, but I also want to take a drink. I see trainers, good. Learners and trainers, yeah. Good. Presenters, trainers, students, everyone. You hit on two of the three that I want to talk about. So I'm going to talk about three different groups that e-learning was disruptive to. First one you mentioned, the learners. Now, a bit of a disclaimer, this picture is not true. And what I mean by that is I work for the Learning Guild. We used to be the e-learning guild up until earlier this year. I work in the learning technology space. I am a firm believer of the power of technology-based learning and how it can truly transform our lives. It's what I've invested a lot of my work in, and it's something I'm extremely passionate about. That said, no one in the history of e-learning has ever been that happy to take a course. So there's a little bit of a lie attached to that photo. But the reality is, when e-learning emerged, it was disruptive to the learning experience. It was, however you want to define the learning role, whether it's a worker, a student, whatever it is, it was disruptive. I mentioned earlier, we're conditioned through 12 plus years of school about what learning looks like. It looks like a facilitator in the front of the room who's got the expertise, sharing it with the novices who are in the seats through some sort of different experiences, often done through lecture. And that's what learning looks like. And now you want me to click next and read slides on a screen and engage in different sorts of experiences? It was really disruptive. Another group that was mentioned, the trainers themselves. I mentioned earlier, when I was a trainer, that was my world. That was my sweet spot. That was my comfort zone. I knew my facilitator guide. I knew how to work a room. I knew how to engage in these in-person environments and get people engaged and create experiences through which they could learn and develop skills. And now you want me to put together a drag and drop interaction, and you want me to develop a course that you can do on a computer. It was really disruptive. And there were a lot of trainers who struggled with this transition. And it was, again, seen as a negative disruption because it was outside of my comfort zone. The third group that I would mention, not individuals, it's the organizations themselves. Now, again, disruptions are positive or negative. I'm kind of leaning when I describe the disruption for learners and for teachers, kind of leans towards I'm pushed outside of my comfort zone. It makes me uncomfortable. It's got a negative connotation to it. Organizations was the exact opposite. When e-learning first emerged, organizations were really enthusiastic about it. You have to realize why that was. It makes sense. Like, wait, so instead of flying people to our training center and paying for their airfare, their travel, their per diem, and their hotels and all of that stuff, they can do it on a computer in the office, and we can save all that other money, and they can get back to work sooner. Sign me up. I'll take that cost savings. Granted, when e-learning first emerged, there were a lot of organizations that leaned too far towards that value proposition, that learning kind of got lost in the shuffle of cost savings. But regardless, when it first emerged, the cost savings was seen as a very positive disruption. So there's a lot of things that one thing that came out, e-learning, the emergence of the personal computer and how it changed the workplace, and through that emerged e-learning. That was a really disruptive period. A lot of us lived through that. But here's the difference between now and then. Then it was just the emergence of the personal computer that changed the way that we work, and through that, the emergence of e-learning changed the way that we support education and training. It was one major piece of technology that disrupted it at one time. What's unique about the environment that we're in right now is there are multiple different trends that are disrupting the future of work. And they're happening concurrently, and they overlap. And it puts us in a very unique position of needing to understand how things are shifting and what it means to the work that we do. And that's what I want to spend the majority of the rest of our time on here today, is to talk about some of these trends, put them into the context of what it means to us as learning professionals and what it means to the future of the work that we do. Another thing I want to point out, as we talk about these trends, there is no right or wrong. There is a right or wrong in your context. I follow the work that I do. I'm in a unique position where it's my job to kind of look at the broad trends, but the broad trends are the data of averaging everything out. Organizations are unique. Every organization has its unique culture, its unique resources. And what makes it right or wrong for them is applying the trend into their context. I've worked for organizations I've worked for an organization where it was a multi-million-dollar organization, and I managed a team of 13 and had, hundreds of thousands of dollars in my budget. I've worked for an organization where I was a team of one. It was a small organization, and the budget consisted of my salary. You can't say that there is a single best option that satisfies both of those worlds. You have to be able to take the trends that we're talking about and put it into the context of what it means for you. And I'm going to try to help you do that. I'm going to talk about the trends, but also talk about the types of things you need to be looking at in order to make a determination of whether or not the trend matters to you. There will also be a couple of times where I will have what I refer to as a soapbox moment, where I will kind of step out of the impartial, here's the information, do with it as you want, and give my own personal perspective on why something does or does not matter, or a unique lens that is specifically to me that I want to share. So with that, let's jump right in. First trend, multi-device learning. A lot of organizations are developing content with multiple users in mind, with the idea that we are going to have multiple types of devices in mind. It used to be a point where you could develop content and just count on it. It was going to be a 4:3 monitor. But now with tablets and smartphones and all sorts of different technology emerging all the time, all of which we can consume information through, we have different aspect ratios and different types of experiences and different types of UX. So you can't really design with just one thing in mind. We have to design with multiple types of devices in mind. And there's a specific type of design that is referred to in this context called responsive design, which with responsive design, if you're not familiar with it, what it's referring to is you design content in one way and the content reformats so that it displays in a way that it's appropriate to consume on the device that someone is particularly using. When e-learning first came about, I mentioned that it was designed for a 4:3 screen. And when tablets and smartphones emerged, early examples of e-learning being consumed on a mobile phone was just taking that 4:3 and shrinking it. And if it wasn't designed for a small smartphone screen, a lot of times it was useless. And it actually repeats a mistake that we make fairly often. It's why I often say that responsive design is not enough. It's a good thing, don't get me wrong, to be able to develop content in a way that it can be, so that it redisplays in a way that is easy to consume regardless of the device that you're on, is not a bad thing. but it does repeat a mistake that we often make in our field. And that is approaching new technologies with the wrong question. Instead of looking at it, what we tend to ask about a new technology is, wow, these tablets emerge, these smartphones emerge. How do I do what I do with these new devices? Which is not a bad question, but I would say it's the wrong question because it's too limiting. It approaches a new technology with the assumption of what I do, as compared to approaching a new technology with a more open question of, wow, these tablets and these smartphones emerged. How does it change what I do? Or what could I do with these new devices that I've never been able to do before? Or what problem could I solve with these new technologies that I've struggled with in the past? Those are different questions. That enables us to push our practice forward. And I bring it up in the context of multi-device learning because we've been through this before. I want to go back to that example I shared earlier about e-learning. For those of you that lived through it, when we went from the classroom to e-learning, what a lot of that was, and even today to a certain extent, sometimes you see this, is taking the classroom content and making it available on a computer. Taking the PowerPoint and the deck, and everyone did, and giving the ability for the person to go through that content on their own, which in and of itself does not necessarily mean it's a bad thing, but it assumes that the experience that was previous is what we need to carry over and port over. And it doesn't necessarily look at it and say, what else could we do? When e-learning first emerged, we didn't look at it and say, wow, we've got these devices with a keyboard and we've got the ability to do input and output, and we've got this mouse that can do different things, and we've got data that can come in. We just took the PowerPoints that we already had and made them available. We've gotten a lot better than that. But with mobile learning, we're kind of doing the same thing with these multiple devices. The device that you have in your pocket right now or on your desk is more than just a screen that you can display content on. It's got an accelerometer. It's got a GPS that has the context of where you are at any given point. It's got more processing power than the computer that you had on your desk a decade ago. It's got a camera on it. It's got all these different functions that your desktop doesn't have. And these unique affordances that enable us to do different things. And if all you're using it as is a different screen, you're leaving all of that off the table. And it's a huge amount that we're leaving off the table. I'll give you a more concrete example of this space of potential that I'm describing. Think about how your organization is using mobile phones in the context of supporting education, training, and performance. Take a moment, just think about that. How are they using it? What type of things did they use with the phone? Take that information, hold it there for a second. Now think about how you've used your phone so far today in your personal life. What sort of things you've done with it. I know in my case, I've used my phone probably 68 different ways today, and I haven't even made a phone call yet. And just to solve problems. It's my alarm clock. It's different things different apps that I do to perform different functions. It's a productivity tool for me. And you're probably not using it in the same way in your organizations in the context of education and training. That gap between how you use it every day personally and how you use it in the context of education and training within your organization, that's a gap of opportunity. And that's the gap of leaving those unique affordances off the table. Think about how we're using these devices in our daily lives and how we solve problems in our daily lives through these technologies. And think about what that means to the work that you do. What opportunities does that present in the work that we do? That's the potential of multi-device learning and why we need to go beyond responsive design. With my first soapbox moment. Next trend.
I have a question.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Regarding multi-device learning. So our sales force uses both tablets and smartphones. And we've had and most of our content has been created. And I just took away, I had a huge takeaway on what you just said, but I just want to go back to something we've struggled with.
Sure.
And most of our content has been created using responsive design, although not all of it has been.
Okay.
The question that we have struggled with is a lot of the initial training or foundational training materials are heavy science.
Okay.
And the feeling is, and this is my feeling, I'll state my opinion, is that learning heavy science on a smartphone is not the way to go. It really needs to be dedicated on something that is giving you a bigger picture more room to navigate information. Do you have any thoughts on that?
With the little context of what we're talking about here, my initial reaction to that is I wouldn't say yes or no. I would say it depends on how you're using it. So, for instance, depending on what the content of the science is, I get that there's a lot of detail, but depending on how it's used, if you have the ability on a smartphone by using multi-touch to dig into the details and encourage people to explore in that manner, it could be creating a unique experience that enables them to dig deeper. The ability to use, I've seen a lot of science-related learning apps that are out there that use AR, that enable you to bring scientific information and assets and things that you can explore into your environment on your phone that in a way you could never do on a desktop. So it sounds like in the context, the limited context you shared there, that maybe in the way that it's being done right now, the desktop is more suited for that, and trying to put that experience over to the phone might be there. But I would put that more, I would say that that's more an assessment of the way the content is being presented today and the type of experience you're sharing. It may not be appropriate for a smartphone, but that doesn't necessarily mean a different type of experience wouldn't be more beneficial through that sort of technology. Does that help?
Thank you. That makes, yes, and that aligns with what you just said before. Cool. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you for the question. So after multi-device learning, next trend, interactive video. Now I want to be clear about what I'm talking about when I say interactive video here. Interactive video, there's a lot of different definitions of what interactive video is. For instance, I could use an average authoring tool and have little video clips that each one ends in a decision, and based on the decision that I make as the learner, a different video clip will play, kind of a choose your own adventure as I continue to show my age, as to where that goes. Yes, that is an interactive experience leveraging video, but that's not what I'm talking about in this context. What I'm talking about in interactive video is the metadata that's attached to it. Right now, if you were going to search for, let's say that this session was being recorded and was being published openly on YouTube. If you wanted to search for this, you could search under my name if you remembered it. You could search under the title. Maybe you could search under something related to the content that if it was in the description of the video, that's the type of thing that a search engine would be able to pick up on it today, which is different than what I'm talking about with interactive video, where the ability to search the metadata, or the ability to, when you do a Google search, for it to include everything that was seen and or said in the video in the search results. So I mentioned earlier that I go back to, I use YouTube all the time to kind of solve things in my house. I have a problem with my toilet, I want to fix it. I don't necessarily know what the problem is, but if I could describe what I'm seeing or the sound that it's making, and someone in a video was describing it because that's what he or she is fixing, and the video was able to, and the search engine was able to push that back to me based on something it found in the video rather than just within the title or something that is text-based and attached to the file, that makes the ability for me to solve problems on my own transformative. And that's just one simple example, but if you take that sort of functionality and you plug it into the work that we do in education and training, that's transformative in terms of our ability to use video as a performance support tool, as something that enables people to solve problems in the moment and get the support that they need to do their jobs. It is a truly transformative type of technology. This technology is not science fiction. It exists today. It's just not evenly distributed. You can't go to YouTube and do the type of search that I'm talking about across all content that's out there. But there are dedicated technologies positioned for the learning and development market, the training market, that enable us to do this with video, that the videos that you add, it will analyze the video and give it that sort of search data. So if you wanted to leverage this sort of functionality in the work that you do, there are tools, closed off tools, not open internet tools, but closed off tools that enable you to do that in your environment. And it is truly a transformative way to use video in the context of education, training, and learning. Next trend, data and analytics. When you hear about data and analytics, you always hear it described in a two-word phrase, big data. What is big data? It's data, but it's really big. And it's a fairly useless description. What's interesting to me about the data and analytics conversation is it's not about the data. It's not about the size of the data. It's not about the computer power that is enabling us to crunch data in ways we've never been able to do before. Although both of those things are really important. We're generating data all the time. We have more data connected to the performance of people in our organizations than we've ever had available before. And we do have the computer processing power to enable us to analyze that data in ways we've never been able to do before. But those aren't the things that make big data so powerful. And I want to show the next graphic. This is the graphic for me that really drives home why big data is such an important thing. I wish I knew where this graphic came from, because it really demonstrates why big data is so important, why it's so transformative. It's not about the data itself. It's not about the analytics and being able to organize the data. It's about using that capability to inform the decisions that we're making. It's about us being able to look at take all of this information and inform what we're doing so that we can do it better going in the future. In the context of learning and development, there are things that are playing in the data and analytics space, tools that we have available. You might have heard about the Experience API or XAPI, which is a new way of tracking data. It's kind of very often referred to as the next generation of SCORM. It's going to enable us to track things beyond just course completions and butts and seats and things of that sort. And some of you watching this video might be in a position that you're either in a position to drive an XAPI project in your organization, or you may actively be doing it. That'd be great. But if you're not, and this is kind of another soapbox moment that applies to things beyond just data analytics, but you may not be in a position to drive a data discussion as it relates to learning and development in your organization. Culturally, positionally, resource-wise, you may not be proactively pushing to transform the way that your organization looks at the data and analytics attached to learning. That doesn't exempt you from the data and analytics conversation. It doesn't exempt you from the ability, the need to be informed about the data and analytics conversation. There's a skill that I increasingly find myself talking about in learning and development that I refer to as conversational competence. My mother would describe it as knowing enough to be dangerous. But when it comes to data, I bring it up in the context of data and analytics, because data and analytics is not an if for your organization or for the work that you do. It's a when. It may be now, it may be 6 weeks from now, it may be 6 months from now, it may be 20 years from now. But data and analytics is going to transform every organization that deals with technology. Unless you are somehow walled off from technology, it's going to transform the way that work happens in your organization. It's going to impact it, and thus the work that you do. And so you are either going to, if you're not proactively driving it, you need to be ready to react to it. Because at some point, you're going to get a knock on the door from your IT department that says, we're putting in a new platform. It's AI driven, it's big data driven. It's going to have an API that's going to connect to the learning management system or LXP or whatever it is that you're using. And it's all going to be connected to the HRIS system so that we can get better understanding of what people are doing and the resources that we need. And we're going to need your support on that. You don't want to be in that situation and say, I understand, just give me 10 minutes to Google everything that you just said. You want to be knowledgeable enough about topics like data and analytics or any sort of technological trend that is shaping the future of work, so that even if you're not proactively driving change in learning and development related to those, you are ready to respond to it when the organization pivots. You want to be knowledgeable enough that you are connected to the trends that are impacting the organizations that you work for, so that when they are presented to you, you are at least ready to participate in the conversation that is going to be required in order for you to effectively support it. That applies to data and analytics, but it applies to just about every emerging technology that's out there. You want to know enough to be dangerous enough to participate in that conversation. That's data and analytics.
So David, just a comment. I think what you're saying is so important. Yeah. I used to work at Johnson & Johnson in the HR department. And what I realized was that they were, when I was working there, they were just starting with the analytics. But what was important is that they had collected data from years ago to start even processing any information. So none of the analytics made any sense, because even if they had data for the last 3 years, they weren't picking it up as the way they were going to analyze it. So if we didn't, you can't just start analyzing things today you would have to collect data over a few, cycles of things before you actually have something to analyze. So that was really, that hit home for me, is that even if you're not starting, big data or analytics today, you probably should start collecting some information ahead of time, thinking, 5 years down the road, there's actually something you can, drive from it. And that was really amazing when I saw that at J&J, that it was just a huge hurdle for them to actually come up with something that works, because there were so many gaps in their data, and they couldn't put it together. But by now, I'm sure that's driving HR programs in big ways. So I'm not sure if anyone's heard anything from it, but I would love to, find out more.
Yeah, there's a lot of, if you go to the link I'll show at the end, there's a lot of different links on ways that you can inform yourself on data and analytics, as well as just kind of trends that are going on within our industry itself. So I encourage you to check some of that stuff out. But I totally agree with what you're saying. Thank you for sharing that.
Thanks.
Next trend, games and gamification. Games and gamification have been around for a while. The reason I put it in the emerging trends is because we are able to use it more because there's more credibility attached to it. There's research attached to the credibility of using games, the effectiveness of using gamification and gaming activities to engage people, the types of activities and how people can learn through those. There's a lot of research emerging on how they can be used, and thus there's a lot more money. There are a lot more tools that are flowing through the games and gamification space that is enabling us to use it in the context of the work that we do more effectively. There's a lot more applications and tools that are out there that enable us to just create experiences. Don't use the word games. Talk about this different type of activity that people are going to be engaged in, that yes, it's a game, but it's more of an activity and journey that they're going to go through via a game, through which learning can happen and skill development can happen. And we're seeing a lot more of that. So I'm glad to see that there's research that's credentializing that in our industry. VR, virtual reality. Virtual reality is an interesting trend to me. I mean, I've always put it in the context of it's got a very powerful use case that is narrow. Anytime that you have, VR has been around for decades. The reason that we've been talking about it the last couple of years is that the cost of hardware and the ability to create content for VR and the latency, most importantly, attached to VR experiences, the technology's caught up. It used to be a case of when you had a VR helmet on and you turned your head, the content was here, and when you turned your head this way, there would be a delay before the content moved over here, and that's what made people throw off. That doesn't exist anymore. The technology stays with you so that it feels more immersive. That's in there. And between Oculus and HTC and the companies that are out there, the cost of generating these sorts of experiences is much more accessible and increasingly becoming accessible. But still, the use case of what these are has always been narrow in my mind. When you have a situation where the risk of failure of a skill is literally life or death, when you have a firefighter, there's a lot of, or healthcare or anything where me practicing a skill and not applying that skill directly literally is the difference between someone living or dying, then the costs of creating an experience that gives people the ability to practice in a safe environment and develop those skills is extremely powerful. So it's a very narrow use case, but an extremely powerful one that enables us to solve a problem we've never been able to solve before. VR is a very important tool in the context of it's enabling us to solve problems we've struggled with as a field in terms of giving people the ability to develop real world practice in a safe environment. And it's very powerful. In the last maybe 8 months, since the pandemic has emerged, there's been another very, very interesting use case that's been emerging, which is this idea of social VR, where we have the ability to go into a space, regardless of our geographical differences, and connect with one another, and the ability to collaborate, create spaces where we can collaborate with one another as if we were in the same room, which those technologies were always there to a certain degree, but they kind of seemed almost gimmicky because we had the ability to be in the same room. But now that we suddenly are living in a world where that could be taken away from us, the ability to feel that connection, to feel that presence of we're all physically in the same room together, and to mimic that in a digital environment, this idea of social VR is skyrocketing in the context of the pandemic. And I've seen some really, really interesting applications that enable you to connect, share, and work with people through VR that we would probably never would have seen had it not been for the pandemic. Most people, when you talk about virtual reality, in conjunction with that always comes augmented reality. Augmented reality, where virtual reality takes you there, augmented reality brings it to you, where it's putting those digital assets against the physical world. And what I find augmented reality, where virtual reality, I said, has a very narrow use case, and VR is a little further out in terms of adoption, or there's more adoption to VR than there is AR. AR is a little further behind in terms of adoption, but it's also got a much broader use case. And I would argue that the use case is not what we're currently seeing in AR, which is smartphone-based AR. Pokemon Go is a game which really drew AR out to people, where you have your phone in your hand, your ability to look through the viewfinder and have digital assets that are giving you more context around the world around you. But I don't think that that's the true potential of AR. I don't think a smartphone AR is, especially in the context of the work that we do, because the reality is if it's through your phone, you can't do anything because you have your phone in your hands. It's only when we get to the point of having this wearable AR, where your hands are free and you have the ability to interact with what you're seeing digitally enhanced in front of you, that the true performance-related potential of AR is going to be realized. The reality is the technology is already there. The ability to create a wearable AR device exists already. The challenge isn't the functionality of the AR, the challenge is the functionality of the fashion. This looks like someone is wearing a clunky helmet on. But as technology continues to advance and the hardware associated with AR gets smaller, and where it fits into glasses that people are wearing every day, and it doesn't look as abnormal, then we're going to see the true transformative power of AR in terms of our ability to just live, work, and play. And it's also going to be a very effective tool for education and training. One other additional point as it relates to AR. AR is not a training tool. It is not an educational tool. It is not a learning tool. You can do all of those things through it, but it is a performance tool. While there are L&D applications, it's not going to necessarily come through L&D to apply AR in your organization. If you work in a manufacturing plant or anything where people are field workers, that's where AR is going to emerge. The AR companies are selling it to the enterprise for the workers to actually do things with. So even if you're not using it in the context of education and training, you're probably going to need to support the implementation of this in your organization. It can come in one of two ways, and you should be prepared to support it in either direction. A couple of more trends. First, big trend in our field is workflow learning. I struggled, when I talk about this, I struggled with what to put on this slide. What I mean by that is that there are a lot of different labels I could apply to this slide. I could do workflow learning, I could do micro-learning, I could do performance support, just-in-time training, or whatever buzzword we want to apply to it next. This is not a new concept. This concept has been around for decades. The idea of what we're talking about here is basically a simple concept of get people what they need, when they need it, where they need it. Bob Mosier and Conrad Gottfredson have done a lot of great work in this space, and they refer to it as giving people the support that they need at the moment of need, the 5 moments of need, and giving people what they need there. There's a lot of resources on the link that I'll share at the end related to that. Why is this a buzzword now? Because the technology's caught up. The technology's caught up in the sense of we now have the ability to give people the support they need while they're working, that we don't need to interrupt. Training as a general thing is a very disruptive force. It by nature requires you to stop working so that you can go be trained to learn something, and then you go back to work to apply it. It literally is a disruption of the work. Workflow learning is looking at it through a different lens and saying, what is the least disruptive way that we can get people the support that they need while they're working? And it is a very different way of supporting work. But there are increasingly technologies and platforms that are enabling us as L&D professionals to support that. Even if you are not necessarily going to have access to technologies that enable you to create interventions in the workflow that can support people, you should be aware that this is a trend just in the design of user experiences. Think about the apps that are on your phone. Most of them do not have start when you launch the app with, here's how to use the app. They're just designed in a way that it's simple to use. And if you get stuck somewhere, it recognizes that you get stuck and gives you the solution that you need, gives you the support that you need to get unstuck. That's what workflow learning is. Workflow, and I tend to go towards the phrase workflow learning because it's very descriptive. It's a very simple definition in the label. It's getting people to learn in the flow of work. That's why I tend to gravitate towards that. And it is a major shift in the terms of the way that we support our organizations. Last trend that I want to talk about is artificial intelligence. This is kind of the overlaying issue of everything that's here, and you hear about it a lot. A lot of our field is a lot of the future of work is being shaped by advancements in artificial intelligence. I think it's an important trend to us understand. I also think it's an important lens through which we look at the work that we do, because when you hear about artificial intelligence being described, it's often described with this sort of a narrative of the robots are taking over and they're taking over our jobs and we're losing control. And that's not the way I see it at all. It's not about technology working against us. It's about technology working with us. It's about us being able to do things with technology. It's about offloading the things that we're doing today to technology that technology is better equipped to handle so that we can focus our attention on the human value. And we're going to increasingly see that just in the future of how we live, work, and play. And that is going to shape expectations that are attached to the way that we support learning. And it's all leaning towards this idea of the Internet of Things is probably a term that you've heard. The Internet of Things is basically that everything everywhere is connected to is generating data and is connected to the Internet. And I'll paint a very quick picture for you of what the future could look like. I have an Apple Watch, and it has a Bluetooth signature that as soon as I put the clasp on and put my code in, it not only is accepting signals from my phone, but it can give an outbound signal that is basically a verified signal that this is David Kelly. I walk up to my computer at work, and not only does it just unlock based on the fact that it's got the signal, but now that it knows that the person at the computer through a verified signal is David Kelly, it can go through the Internet of Things, connect to my HRIS system, my LXP. It can go to whatever resource is analyzing the competency that I have with the piece of equipment that I am currently sitting at, and now respond. That piece of equipment with that knowledge can respond with the appropriate layer of support needed based on whether I'm a novice with that piece of equipment, intermediate, or advanced user. That's not science fiction. Everything that I just described in that scenario, the framework exists. All the unique components to make that experience happen exist. It's just that all the solution providers out there are looking to package it in a different way and put that together. So that's the future of what this all looks like. So what do all of these things mean, as I get to the end of my time here, mean to the future of L&D? And what does this all mean to us? It's changing the way that we look at things. You're gonna hear a lot about learning and performance ecosystems and how the tools that we use for education and training are just one part of how we support a workforce. And I believe some of our sponsors are going to be talking about this in some of the sponsorship sessions after this. We are looking at a broader ecosystem of how people are getting supported in their learning and how they do their job. And we need to understand what we impact in that space, but also what we don't impact in that space and how it impacts the person that we are supporting. We're also going to hear a lot about this idea of learning personalization. The phrase Netflix of learning pops around a lot. I don't necessarily that phrase doesn't necessarily resonate with me because that's more of a recommendation engine as compared to the scenario that I painted a second ago, where it's bringing my competency into the mix. It's not just what I like or what I prefer, it's what I need based on my competency. And I don't believe that we're there yet as an industry toward that personalization, but it is emerging rapidly. And then again, it comes back to this phrase, digital learning. And as you get to the point of analyzing what digital learning is and how we can support it in our organizations, I encourage you to go back to where we started from. What does digital learning mean? Where should we be focused when we talk about digital learning? And if you're talking about a digital learning strategy in your organization, listen to what you're saying. If you're talking about it and you're hearing yourself or people in your organization or people on your team just using phrases that are talking about what we're doing and how we're educating and how we're training, that's not a bad thing. That's what we do, and it's what we focus on. It's how we support our organizations. But that is a very siloed discussion around digital learning. That is a digital education and training discussion, which is not a bad thing, but let's acknowledge it for what it is. The real potential of pivoting our field and supporting people in a different way, the way that we're naturally increasingly living, working, and playing, is focusing on the learning piece and talking in the context of activities and behaviors connected to learning as compared to just educational and training. So with that, as we reach the end of our time, I want to thank you for coming in here. I want to remind you of that URL I mentioned earlier, which will take you to this page on my blog, which will have the slides. It'll have a whole bunch of resources if you wanted to dig in further. And with that, I believe we're hitting the end of our time here. This is ways that you can contact me if you wanted to reach out and continue this conversation. I obviously love talking about these things. And I will close by saying thank you. I think we have like a minute or so left. If anyone has any additional questions, other than that, but you can contact me via here. Thank you again for taking the time to chat with me here today.